There was a woman in Harrow's Cove, Maine, who stood on a granite ledge the morning after her husband's funeral and began to measure the rocks with her bare hands. She had no tools. She had no plan anyone could see. She had a storm lantern in one hand and a piece of paper folded 4 times in the other, and the whole village watched her from the dock and waited for her to cry. She didn't cry. She crouched down, pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, and counted. People said she'd lost her mind. The minister said grief took people different ways. Aldous Voss, her brother-in-law, said she had until the end of the week to clear her things from the house and find somewhere else to be. But what none of them knew was that the paper she held had been folded into the pocket of her dead husband's coat. And what her husband had drawn on that paper in his careful hand, in the language of the country they both came from, was not a farewell. It was a blueprint. Before we go any further, if you've ever found something left behind by someone you loved, something that told you they were thinking of you even when you didn't know it, then this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe and stay with us tonight. Stories like this one deserve to be told slowly, and we tell them that way. The winter of 1879 came early to the Maine coast. By the first week of October, the fog that rolled in off the Atlantic had turned from gray to something closer to white, the kind of cold fog that settled into your collar and didn't leave until April. Harrow's Cove sat at the end of a rocky peninsula 20 miles north of Rockland, too small for most maps, large enough to have a post office, a general store, a Lutheran church with a bell that didn't ring straight, and a harbor that sheltered 14 fishing boats in good weather and 9 in bad. Einar Voss had been the captain of one of those boats. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been shaped by 30 years of rope and salt water into something that looked less like flesh than carved wood. He had come to Harrow's Cove from Gothenburg when he was 17, learned English from the men he worked alongside on the docks, married Astrid Hallenberg when they were both 22, and spent the next 19 years building a life that was modest by any measure but his own, which was the only measure that had ever mattered to him. Astrid was 41 years old when Einar went out on a Tuesday night in late September and did not come back. The storm that took him was not the largest one anyone could remember. That distinction belonged to the nor'easter of 1869, which had driven 2 schooners onto the rocks below Owl's Head and left 40 families without fathers or sons. The storm of September 1879 was smaller, a fast-moving system that came in off the open Atlantic, with less warning than it should have given, building in the dark hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the harbor was quiet, and the sky had the false stillness that experienced sailors distrusted and inexperienced ones mistook for safety. Einar had been experienced. Everyone in Harrow's Cove knew that, which was why afterward no one could fully explain why he had gone out. Astrid couldn't explain it either. She had been asleep when he left. She woke to the sound of the wind changing pitch, the way it lifted from a low moan to something sharper, almost like a voice, and reached across the bed to find his side empty and cold. She lay still for a moment listening. Then she rose, dressed in the dark, and went to stand at the window that faced the harbor. She could see the lamp on the dock. She could not see his boat. They found the wreck 3 days later lodged between 2 granite outcroppings on the south side of the peninsula. The hull had split cleanly the way wood splits when it is driven fast against something that will not move. They did not find Einar. The sea in this was not generous. Astrid received his coat from the harbor master on a Thursday morning. It had been recovered from the wreck, soaked through with salt water, smelling of everything the ocean smells like when it takes something it was never supposed to have. She brought it home and hung it by the door, and stood looking at it for a long time before she put her hands into the pockets. The left pocket held a length of tarred twine knotted in a way she didn't recognize. The right pocket held a piece of paper folded into quarters, the edges soft from moisture, the ink still legible because Einar had pressed hard when he wrote. She unfolded it at the kitchen table with the storm lantern burning beside her. The one he kept on the boat recovered with the coat, its glass smoked, but the wick still sound. The lantern gave off a warm amber light that moved slightly the way flame always moves when it is alive, and by that light she read what her husband had drawn. It was a sketch, not detailed in the way an architect's drawing is detailed, but precise in the way that a man who has spent his life reading water and wind and stone is precise, everything in its correct proportion, every measurement noted in small numerals along the margins, every note written in Swedish because that was the language they used when it was just the 2 of them. För den dag jag inte kommer tillbaka. For the day I do not come back. She sat with the paper for a long time. The lantern burned steadily. Outside, the harbor made its harbor sounds, the knock of boats against their moorings, the low complaint of the wind working through the dock pilings, the distant call of something she couldn't identify. She read the Swedish words again. Then she folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket close to her body, where she would feel it if she needed to remember it was there. 3 weeks later, Aldous Voss came to the house. He was Einar's older brother by 4 years, and he had always occupied a particular position in the life of Harrow's Cove, not the most powerful man in the village, but the man who understood power well enough to stay close to it. He ran the smallest of the 3 chandleries on the waterfront, supplied cordage and lamp oil and barrel staves to the fishing fleet, and served on the town committee in a capacity that gave him access to information without requiring him to take positions on anything that might later be held against him. He was practical in the way that people are practical when they have never had to be anything else. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, which was deliberate. Wednesday afternoon was when the general store received its weekly freight, and most of the village was occupied elsewhere, which meant there would be no one to watch him arrive or leave. Astrid was in the kitchen when she heard his boots on the step. She did not go to the door. She waited. He came in without knocking, the way men come into houses they have already decided belong to them, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that had been arranged to look like grief and managed to look instead like calculation. His voice came careful and measured. "Astrid, I've given this as much time as I could, but the house is Voss property and the estate needs to be settled." She was standing at the window watching the harbor. She didn't turn around. "Einar built this house. Einar built it on Voss land with Voss timber, and the deed has always been held by the family. You know this." She knew no such thing, but she also knew that Aldous had access to documents she had never been shown, and that in Harrow's Cove in 1879 a widow's understanding of property law was only as reliable as the man willing to explain it to her honestly. She turned then and looked at him. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed his lines and found them adequate. "How long?" she said. "End of the week. I'll have someone come for the furniture that belongs to the estate. You're welcome to your personal things." He paused. "I'm sorry, Astrid. There's no other way to handle it." He left. She listens to his boots on the step again, and then the sound of the road taking him away, and then nothing but the harbor and the lantern and the folded paper in her apron pocket. She had $4.30 in the house, 2 flour sacks she could use for carrying, Einar's storm lantern, and a piece of paper that said her husband had been thinking of her survival before she had begun thinking of it herself. She put on her coat and walked to the water. The granite ledge that Einar had drawn in his sketch sat at the southern end of Harrow's Cove, past the last of the dock pilings, where the land rose steeply from the tide line and the rock faces jutted out over the water in flat shelves worn smooth by 10,000 years of Atlantic weather. It was not a comfortable place. It was not a place where anyone lingered. The wind worked around it from 3 directions, and the footing was uncertain in wet weather, and the local understanding was that the ledge belonged to no one, because no one wanted it. Astrid had walked past it 1,000 times without looking at it the way a carpenter looks at timber. She looked at it that way now. The highest shelf sat approximately 6 feet above the storm tide line. She had lived on this coast long enough to know that measurement by instinct, the way you know the height of a door frame in your own house without measuring it. The shelf was roughly flat, perhaps 15 feet wide and 12 feet deep where it met the rock face behind it. The rock face itself curved slightly at the base, not dramatically but enough that the junction between vertical stone and horizontal shelf created a natural shelter from the north wind, which was the wind that mattered in a Maine winter. Einar had known this. He had stood on this ledge or thought about it from the water, or perhaps both, and he had seen what she was only now seeing, that the ledge was buildable, that it was protected on 2 sides by granite that would never rot or warp or let in water, that it was above the flood line, that it faced southeast away from the worst of the weather and toward the morning light. She crouched and pressed her palm against the stone the way she had done the morning of his funeral, and felt the cold of it move up through her hand and into her arm. Granite holds cold the way it holds everything completely without apology for as long as it needs to. But it also holds warmth, and in a structure with the right design, that thermal mass became something useful. something a person could rely on. Along the tide line below the ledge, the winter storms had been depositing gifts for decades. The granite boulders at the water's edge were flanked by driftwood of every dimension: ship's timbers, dock planks, spruce and pine, and the occasional piece of tropical hardwood that had made its way north from somewhere warmer. There were also flat stones of varying sizes pried loose from the seafloor by storm action and deposited in rows like unordered inventory. And running along the back of the ledge where the rock face met the shelf, there was a line of large, flat granite slabs with natural straight edges, the kind of stone that in Scotland and in the Northern Islands had been used for centuries to build walls that required no mortar and no nails, and nothing that cost money. She stood up and looked at all of it for a long time. Then she took the paper from her pocket, unfolded it, and compared what Einar had drawn against what she was seeing. They matched, almost exactly. He had drawn the ledge from memory, or from a careful study he had made without telling her. He had marked the driftwood timber positions. He had indicated the flat stone deposits. He had sketched a structure that used all of these things: the rock face as a back wall, the flat stones as courses of dry-laid walling, the driftwood timbers as roof joists, and above the joists, the corbelled stone slabs and overlapping courses that her father had shown her once in a book about the old stone buildings of Scandinavia and the Scottish Islands. Corbelling. Each stone course projecting slightly beyond the one below it, each new stone's weight pressing down on the one behind it rather than hanging off it. No mortar, no nails. The arch formed by the angle of the stones rather than by any external fastening. Buildings constructed this way in Ireland had stood for 4,000 years. Einar had known this. She had known this distantly, the way you know things your father told you that you did not yet understand the purpose of. Now she understood the purpose. She folded the paper again and walked back toward the village. She needed to know something before she could begin. The town clerk's office occupied a single room at the back of the town hall, separated from the main hall by a wooden partition that muffled sound without eliminating it. The clerk was a thin man named Horace Pratt, who wore the same brown suit every day and kept his records in a system that only he fully understood, which gave him a quiet authority he would not otherwise have possessed. Astrid came in on a Friday morning before the morning's business had fully begun and asked to see the property records for the southern shore of Harrow's Cove, specifically the Granite Ledge south of the last dock piling. Pratt looked at her over his spectacles for a moment. Then he went to his files. He was gone for some time. When he came back, he was carrying a folder that was thinner than she expected, and his expression had shifted slightly, not toward sympathy exactly, but toward something more careful, the way a man looks when he has found something in a file that he hadn't expected to find. He set the folder on the counter between them and opened it to a document dated June 14, 1851. The handwriting was faded but legible, the legal language dense and archaic but navigable if you read slowly. She read it slowly. The ledge and the stone shelf below it, together comprising approximately 1/4 acre of coastal granite, had been conveyed to one Einar Voss, mariner of Harrow's Cove, Maine, in June of 1851 for consideration of $12 paid to the estate of the previous holder. The conveyance had been duly recorded, and the taxes, small as they were for land of no commercial value, had been paid every year since. She kept her eyes on the document for a moment after she had finished reading it. Then she looked up at Pratt. His voice came quiet. "He bought it when he was 17, Mrs. Voss. First year he was in the country, best I can tell. Paid for it himself. 17 years old. A boy who had crossed an ocean alone and within his first year in a new country had used some portion of his small wages to purchase a worthless piece of rock on the edge of the Atlantic. Because he had looked at it and seen something. Because he had understood, even at 17, that the land no one wanted was the land no one would take from you." She asked Pratt for a copy of the document. He provided it without being asked twice. She walked home with the copy in her coat pocket beside the folded sketch, and she was thinking about the will, because Einar would have made one. She knew him well enough to know that. A man who bought land at 17 and remembered it 30 years later did not leave the disposition of his estate to chance or to the assumptions of his older brother. There would be a will somewhere. And if there was a will, it would say what Einar intended to happen to the land he had purchased with his first wages in a country that was not yet his. She found it that afternoon in a tin box beneath the loose board in the corner of the woodshed that Einar had always kept locked, and that she had assumed held the spare parts for the boat's bilge pump. The box held the pump parts, a small amount of cash she did not count immediately, and a folded document sealed with a wax that had softened in the summer heat and re-hardened imperfectly. She brought the document inside and set it on the kitchen table beside the storm lantern. The lantern burned. The flame moved slightly in the draft from the door. She opened the will. It was written in Einar's hand, not the compact, carefully calibrated hand of the sketch, but the slower, more deliberate hand he used for things that mattered. He had dated it September 4th, 1879. 18 days before he died. She read it twice. Then she sat for a long time without moving. The will was simple and specific. The property on the southern ledge of Harrow's Cove, together with any structures on it or to be built upon it, passed to Astrid Voss, his wife, in full and without condition. The fishing boat and its contents passed to the harbor fund to be used for the equipment of men who could not afford their own. The cash in the tin box, she counted it now $42 more than she had known they had passed to Astrid entirely. She read the date again. September 4th, 18 days before the storm. He had known. Not that he would die, no man can know that with certainty. But he had understood the possibility clearly enough that he had taken steps. He had put his affairs in order. He had made sure she would not be left without ground to stand on. Which meant he had also understood what it meant that Aldous would try to take the house. He had accounted for that. He had left her the one piece of land Aldous had never thought to want, and he had drawn her a blueprint for how to use it, and he had put both things in places she would find them. The storm lantern sat on the table between her and the window. Outside, the harbor moved in its perpetual gray motion, the boats rocking on the October swell, the fog sitting low over the water, the way it always did at this time of year. The light from the lantern caught the edge of the window glass and threw a small reflection back into the room, a second dimmer flame moving in the cold pane. Astrid rose. She put on her coat. She folded the will and put it in her inside pocket close to her chest, and picked up the storm lantern with her right hand. She walked to the town clerk's office. She laid the document on Horace Pratt's counter and waited while he read it. Aldous Voss arrived 12 minutes later. She had not sent for him, which meant he had been watching for her, which meant he knew about the will and had been hoping she would not find it. He came in with the certainty of a man who believes his version of events is the only version, and he looked at the document on the counter, and he looked at Pratt, and he looked at Astrid. He started to speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not move from where she stood. She simply set the storm lantern down on the counter beside the document, gently, carefully, the way you set down something you intend to pick up again. And she looked at her brother-in-law with the full weight of everything she now understood, and she said, "I'll take what's mine." Pratt stamped the document. Aldous stood very still for a moment, the color changing in his face through several stages. Then he turned and walked out. The clerk looked at Astrid. She looked at the lantern, at the way the flame held steady in the closed room, at the amber light it cast on the old wood of the counter, and the old paper of the document, and the old stone walls of the building around them. She picked up the lantern. She picked up her copy of the will. Outside, the fog was still sitting on the harbor. The boats were still rocking. The granite ledge at the southern end of the cove was still there, exactly where it had always been, waiting for whatever she decided to build on it. She began. The first morning, she did nothing but move stones. It was not the dramatic beginning she might have imagined if she had imagined this at all, which she had not. There was no ceremony to it, no moment of decision that felt like a decision, rather than a continuation of something already in motion. She simply put on her oldest work clothes in the gray light before sunrise, picked up the storm lantern, and walked south along the shore path to the ledge. And when she arrived, she began moving the flat granite slabs from where they lay at the base of the rock face to the spots where Einar's sketch indicated they should go. The slabs were heavy. Most of them required her to walk them rather than lift them, tipping them onto one edge and walking them forward on that edge, a technique her father had shown her when she was a girl, and they were clearing stones from a field that no longer existed in a country she had not seen in 20 years. The morning was cold and perfectly still, the fog dense enough to muffle sound, and she worked in a silence that was not empty, but full of the weight of stone and the sound of her own breathing, and the occasional shift of the lantern's flame as the air moved around her. By 8 o'clock she had moved 11 of the large slabs. Her hands were raw. The sky had lightened to the particular shade of pale gray that meant the sun was up behind the fog, invisible but present. She set the lantern down on a flat rock beside her work and straightened her back and looked at what she had done. Nell's parrot was standing 20 feet away on the shore path watching her. He was a solid, weathered man of 50, with hands almost as large as Einar's had been, and he had the expression of someone who has stopped to look at something unexpected and is still deciding what to make of it. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing either. The fog moved between them slow and without purpose. His voice came careful, not unkind. "Mrs. Voss, what are you building?" "A storage structure, for the winter." He looked at the slabs she had moved at the rock face behind them, at the driftwood timbers she had pulled from the tide line and stacked above the watermark. He was a man who built and repaired things for a living, and he looked at all of this the way such a man looks at materials, with a kind of involuntary assessment, the habit of calculating what could be made from what was present. "Dry stone," he said finally. It was not a question. "Dry stone," she agreed. He stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded once to himself rather than to her and walked on. She picked up the lantern and went back to work. By the end of the third day, she had the outline of the structure clear on the ground, the footprint of the walls marked with small stones, the timber joists laid out in order of placement, the flat slabs sorted by size and organized along the back wall like a library of possible choices. The form of what she was building existed now as an intention, a shape pressed into the space on the granite ledge, waiting to be filled with stone. It was late afternoon, the light going amber through the thinning fog, when she found the thing in the wreck. She had gone back to the hull that afternoon to look for additional timber. There were sections she hadn't fully assessed yet, places where the wood had seemed sound beneath the exterior damage. She was working her way along the interior of the split-hull testing planks with her weight before trusting them when her boot came down on something that was not wood. She crouched. Pressed into the angle where the keel met the lowest rib, wedged in a gap that would have been hidden when the hull was intact, was a small canvas bag, oilskin wrapped, tied with a half hitch that she recognized because Einar had taught it to her on their second summer together as the knot you used when you needed something to hold in water. She untied it. Inside the oilskin was a small brass bosun's whistle, the kind a captain used to signal his crew, worn smooth from years of handling, and a folded piece of paper smaller than the sketch, the ink blurred at the edges, but the central portion still legible. She brought it up into the light. It was not a full letter. It was less than a page, written quickly, some of the words crowding together in a way that suggested urgency or perhaps emotion held tightly back. The date at the top was September 19th, 1879, 2 days before the storm. She read it once. She read it again. Then she sat down on the wet timber of the broken hull and held the paper in both hands and looked out at the gray water and the gray sky and the small amber light of the storm lantern where she had set it on a rock above the tide line. And she stayed very still for a long time, because what she had read required stillness. In the way that certain truths always do, they are too large to stand up with immediately. You have to sit with them first. What Einar had written was this, that on the evening of September 19th, his brother Aldous had come to him with a contract. A freight delivery timed for the following Tuesday night, carrying a load of barrel staves to a buyer down the coast who had already paid for them and would not accept delay. The contract held a penalty clause for non-delivery. The penalty was larger than the value of the house. If Einar refused to go, or if he went and arrived late, Aldous would invoke the clause and collect against the property, and Aldous, as the family's eldest, and as the man who held certain records that Einar had not known to verify, had told Einar that the house would fall to him. Einar knew the weather was turning. He said so in the letter. He wrote, "I have seen the signs all week. Tuesday night will be bad." Aldous knows this as well as I do. He had gone anyway. He had gone because the alternative was Astrid losing the house with no warning, no preparation, no plan. He had gone to give her time. The sketch had been drawn before the contract. The land had been bought 24 years before the contract. The will had been drafted 18 days before the contract. Einar had been building toward this moment, not because he knew he would die, but because he knew his brother. And he had spent 30 years quietly ensuring that whatever Aldous eventually did could not leave Astrid with nothing. And Aldous had taken the house anyway after. on the assumption that Astrid didn't know. She sat on the broken hull until the fog came back in thick enough to blur the lantern's light, and then she rose and she picked up the lantern and she walked back to the ledge where the stones were waiting in their organized rows. The flame held steady in the evening air, throwing a steady light across the gray granite, across the sorted timber, across the outline on the ground that showed exactly where the walls were going to stand. She had what she needed now. Not money, not lumber, not help from anyone who had not already offered it freely. She had the full truth of what had happened. She had her husband's last instructions. She had $42 in a tin box, $4 in her coat, a piece of land Aldous had never thought to want, and a storm lantern that had come back from the wreck with the wick still sound. In the morning she would begin to build the walls. She started with the corners. Every structure that lasts begins at its corners, and Astrid knew this the way she knew the weight of stone, not from reading but from her hands. Her father had told her once in the flat vowels of Swedish that she still heard sometimes in her dreams. Corners are where a building makes its promises. If the corners are right, the walls that follow will be right. If the corners are wrong, nothing you do afterward can fully correct them. She set the first foundation stones before sunrise, working by lantern light, fitting the largest flat slabs into the angles where the rock face met the ledge floor. The stone was cold enough that it pulled the warmth from her fingers through her gloves. She worked without gloves. She needed to feel the surfaces. The second morning, the first wall began to rise. Dry stone walling is patient work. It does not reward hurry. Each stone must be chosen for the specific gap it will fill, not forced, not shimmied, but set so that its weight travels cleanly downward through the stones below it, distributing pressure rather than concentrating it. Astrid had watched her father do this once a long time ago in the stone fencing of a Swedish farm that had been her grandfather's. She remembered the principle. She did not fully remember the practice. By mid-morning of the second day, she understood the difference. The first course of stones went well. They were large, heavy, and their mass made them forgiving. Even an imperfectly placed stone of that size would hold under its own weight. The second course was where the trouble began. The stones were smaller, and she was attempting to lay them in a pattern that maintained the batter, the slight inward lean of the wall face that gave dry stone its structural integrity. Without the batter, the wall would stand upright and then under any lateral pressure fall outright. With it, the wall became self-correcting, each course pressing into the courses below. She could not feel the angle. She knew it was supposed to be there, a few degrees, barely visible but measurable with a plumb bob or a practiced eye. Her eye was not yet practiced. Her plumb bob was a length of string with a bolt tied to one end, and it was accurate enough to show her that the second course had drifted not dangerously but noticeably away from the angle that would make the wall trustworthy. She took it apart and laid it again. It drifted again, this time in the other direction. On the third attempt, she got two courses that looked right. She spent the afternoon on the third course and went home in the dark with her hands bleeding at the knuckle joints where the stone edges had found the gaps between her fingers, and she sat at the kitchen table with the storm lantern burning between her and the window, and she looked at the lantern for a while before she looked at the sketch. The sketch was clear. Einar's proportions were exact. The problem was not the design. The problem was that knowing a thing and being able to do a thing are separated by a distance that only practice can cross, and she had not had the practice. The next morning, two more courses. Steady, deliberate, each stone turned in her hands before it was placed, each joint checked with her fingers for the slight rocking that meant a stone was not fully seated. She was getting better. Slowly, the way the tide rises, too gradually to watch, but you look away and look back and the water is higher. It was on the fourth morning that the southeast wall let go. She was not there when it fell. She had walked back to the tide line to pull two more driftwood timbers up above the watermark, and when she returned with the first timber balanced across her shoulders, she saw the stones on the ground in the particular scattered pattern that meant collapse rather than settling, and she stood and looked at it for a moment before she set the timber down. The wall had been 4 courses high. Now it was rubble spread across 3 feet of ledge in the gray morning light, each stone exactly where gravity had put it. She sat down beside the fallen wall. Not in defeat, she was not ready to call it defeat, but in the specific stillness that precedes an honest assessment. The morning was very quiet. The harbor sound was muffled by the fog. The storm lantern, which she had set on the ledge behind her, threw an amber circle of light that reached almost to her feet and stopped. She heard footsteps on the path before she heard anything else. They were not Nels Parrot's footsteps. His were heavy and deliberate, the footsteps of a man who has earned his weight. These were lighter, more careful, the footsteps of someone who has learned to move through the world without taking up more space than necessary. She did not turn around. Cecily Briggs sat down beside her on the cold stone without any preamble or greeting, as if she had simply happened to be passing and had found a convenient place to rest. She was 67 years old, with a face that had been weathered into something that was past pretty, and had arrived at handsome, the kind of face that only comes from spending a long time in weather, paying close attention. She had been widowed twice, had come to Harrow's Cove from Scotland by way of Boston, and had occupied for the 30-odd years Astrid had known of her the particular position in the village that belongs to women of a certain age and intelligence who have stopped trying to be anything other than what they are. She looked at the fallen wall for a moment. Then she picked up one of the stones nearest to her and turned it over in her hands. Her voice, when it came, was unhurried. "You're not angling your through stones." Astrid looked at the stone in Cecily's hands. It was one of the longer, flatter pieces she'd been using for the middle courses, chosen for its size rather than its shape. "Through stones," Astrid said. "Every third or fourth course you want a stone that runs the full width of the wall. Tie the two faces together. Without them, you've got two separate stacks leaning against each other. Looks like a wall until it decides not to be." Cecily set the stone down between them. "My father built stone fencing in Argyll. I watched him do it from the time I could walk." Astrid looked at the rubble of the fallen wall and thought about the stones she had chosen. She had been selecting for surface area stones that would fill the face of the wall most efficiently. She had not been thinking about what was happening inside the wall in the dark interior where the two faces met. "You watched," Astrid said. "Did you build some, enough to know where you went wrong?" Cecily paused. "You didn't ask." "I didn't know to ask." "No." Something in Cecily's voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but more open. "People who haven't built this way before usually don't know to ask. They think they're building a wall. They're actually building two walls and hoping the middle holds." She picked up another stone, a longer one this time, and held it horizontally. "A stone like this, running full width at the base of every fourth course, that's what keeps the two faces honest with each other." They sat together in the fog for a while. The lantern burned behind them, its light steady on the cold stone. Astrid rose first. She went to the sorted stones along the back wall and began to look for the longest, flattest pieces she had set aside. Cecily watched without directing. She answered questions when she was asked them. She did not volunteer information until Astrid's hands went in the wrong direction, and then she said simply and without commentary what the hands should do instead. By the end of that morning, the wall had been rebuilt to 4 courses, and it did not rock when Astrid pressed her weight against it from the side. She did not thank Cecily because Cecily had not offered help in a way that invited thanks. She had sat down beside a problem and addressed it, which was a different thing entirely. When Astrid looked up from the wall at midday, Cecily was already making her way back up the path toward the village, moving carefully over the wet rock, her dark coat disappearing into the fog. Astrid went back to work. The wall building took 9 days in total. During those 9 days, certain things happened in the village that Astrid only understood partially at the time and more fully later. Nels Parrot came back on the 5th day. Not on his way somewhere else this time, but deliberately with his hands in his coat pockets and the look of a man who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion he wasn't expecting. He stood at the top of the ledge and watched her work for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he asked, without any particular inflection, whether she needed help moving the roof timbers into position. She said she'd let him know when she reached that stage. He nodded and left. The following morning she arrived to find 3 additional driftwood timbers on the ledge, cut to roughly the right length, placed above the high water mark. Nobody's name was on them. Nobody came to claim credit. She measured them against Einar's sketch and found they were within an inch of the dimensions she needed. On the 7th day, she found a length of good hemp rope coiled on the ledge beside her sorted stones. On the 8th day, there was a small pot of pine pitch sitting in the lee of the rock face, sealed with a circle of cloth, still warm enough that it had been carried recently. The village was watching in its sideways fashion, and what it was seeing was changing what it thought. This is how opinion moves in a small community, not through conversation, not through persuasion, but through accumulated evidence. People watched Astrid work. They saw that she worked the same way every day with the same materials according to the same plan. They saw the wall rise course by course. They saw that it did not fall. They said nothing, or they said very little, but they left rope on the ledge and pitch by the wall and timber cut to the right length, and in this way they said the thing they were not ready to say aloud. Aldous Voss watched also. She knew this without seeing it, the way you know when a weather system is building offshore, not from observation, but from pressure, a change in the air around a place that tells you something is organizing itself against you. He had not approached her again since the morning at the town clerk's office. But she heard through the small channels by which information moves in Harrow's Cove that he had made inquiries about the ledge's access to the harbor approach, about whether a structure there might interfere with the navigation of fishing boats coming in and out of the cove. She was laying the corbelled capstones on the roof section, the most precise and unforgiving part of the work, each stone projecting a calculated inch beyond the one below it. The whole series building toward a closure point that had to be planned from the beginning, or it would not work. When Nels Parrott came and told her that Aldous had brought a petition to the town committee, the petition asked that any structure on the southern ledge be reviewed for its impact on harbor navigation and that construction be paused pending that review. The review was scheduled for the following Thursday, a week away. She continued setting the capstone in her hands. She pressed it into position, checked the projection angle, and seated it with 2 careful taps of the wooden mallet she'd made from a branch in a smooth stone. "Does the structure interfere with navigation?" Parrott asked. "Look at the chart," she said. "The ledge is 40 feet east of the harbor line. A boat coming through the main approach would have to actively turn toward it to be affected." She set the next stone. "Aldous knows this." Parrott was quiet for a moment. "He's going to say the lantern's a hazard. Light source near the harbor entrance that could confuse boats coming in at night." She paused with the stone in her hands. She had not thought about the lantern in those terms. She set it on the ledge every night when she worked late. It was a working lantern, not a signal. But she could see how a man who had already decided to oppose her could describe it differently. A light near the harbor mouth, unpredictable in its timing, carried by a woman who was operating outside the understood social order of the village. It was the kind of argument that didn't need to be true to cause trouble. She set the stone. "I'll be at the review," she said. The structure was complete on a Wednesday. The Thursday morning light came in off the harbor in pale, flat sheets, and Astrid stood on the ledge and looked at what had been built and felt something that was not pride. Exactly, pride was too loud for what she felt. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of having done a thing correctly, of having honored the instructions she had been given, of having been equal to the situation her husband had trusted her to handle. The walls stood 4 feet high on the open sides, blending into the rock face on the north and west. The roof came to just over 6 feet at its center, the corbelled stones interlocking in a gentle curve that would shed rain to either side without directing it toward the door. The single opening faced southeast toward the morning light. Inside, the space was dry and windless, the temperature several degrees warmer than the air outside the thermal mass of the granite, already beginning to do the work Einar had understood it would do. She had spent in total $4.60. Rope pitch, a small iron hook she'd bought from the blacksmith for mounting the lantern. Everything else had come from the ledge, the tide line, and the quiet generosity of people whose names she did not know with certainty. She put the storm lantern inside on a flat stone near the opening where its light would reach both the interior and the path outside. Then she walked to the town hall for the review. The room was the same room where Harrow's Cove settled all its significant questions, low-ceilinged, wood-paneled, smelling of old fire and old decision. The committee was 3 men, the harbor master, a selectman named Bray, and the town constable who was there to maintain order and generally did so by saying very little. Aldous Voss sat to one side with the posture of a man who is prepared thoroughly. Astrid sat on the other side alone. Aldous spoke first. His argument was organized and delivered carefully. The ledge's proximity to the harbor approached the unpredictable light source, the precedent of allowing unauthorized structures on coastal land, the importance of maintaining clear navigation signals so that the lantern she kept burning would not be confused with the harbor lamp. He spoke for approximately 15 minutes. He cited a maritime regulation from 1871 that technically applied to signal lights in navigable channels. He was measured and reasonable and completely wrong about the geography which he appeared to be hoping no one would check. The harbor master looked at the chart and found that the ledge sat 43 feet east of the recognized harbor line. He said so. Aldous modified his argument. The concern was principally about the light. Then Cecily Briggs came in. She had not been announced. She simply opened the door and came in and sat down in the back of the room, and when the harbor master looked at her with the question on his face, she said, "I have information relevant to the matter before this committee." She testified for 7 minutes. In that time, she established that she had been in Harrow's Cove in the early morning hours of September 21st, 1879, the night of the storm, and that she had observed Aldous Voss in conversation with Einar Voss on the dock, and that the nature of that conversation, which she had recorded in her private journal that same morning because it had troubled her, had been a demand from Aldous that Einar complete the freight run under penalty of a clause that Cecily quoted from memory, because she had a memory for things she wrote down, and she had written this down with care. She had said nothing at the time because she had not understood what it meant. She understood now. The room was very quiet when she finished. The harbor master looked at Aldous. The selectman looked at the table. The constable, for the first time in Astrid's memory, looked as if he might have something to say. Aldous said nothing. His face went through several things that were not expressions so much as attempts at expressions, arrangements of features that were aiming for composure and arriving somewhere near it, but not quite. He stood after a moment and left the room without speaking. The selectman cleared his throat. The committee conferred for 4 minutes. Construction on the southern ledge would be permitted to continue. The storm lantern, as a working light used by the property owner during the performance of labor, was not subject to maritime signal regulations. The petition was dismissed. Astrid walked home along the harbor path in the October light, which had the particular clarity that comes after fog lifts everything sharp-edged. The boat standing out against the water in precise detail, the granite of the ledge ahead of her, catching the sun at a low angle and turning a color that was almost warm. The storm lantern was inside the structure where she had left it. She carried it home. It was Nels Parrott who first told her about the Dowell family. He came to the ledge on a Saturday morning 3 days after the committee hearing, and he stood for a moment looking at the completed structure with an expression she had come to recognize in him, the involuntary assessment, the habit of judgment held in check until he had enough information. Then he said, "Hector Dowell came to me asking about work. His wife's expecting again, and between the hand and the season they're going to be short." She had known of Hector Dowell by sight and circumstance. A fishing accident 2 years previous, the details of which she did not know fully. What she knew was the result, which was a left arm that ended below the elbow, and a man who had made his life by the water and could no longer make it the same way. He was 37. Opal, his wife, was 34, and they had 4 children still young enough to need everything a child needs. What kind of work did he ask for? Anything. He's not particular. Parrott paused. He's not a man who asks easily. She thought about this for a moment, looking at the structure. She was thinking about next spring. She was thinking about what a person who has just built one thing and knows how to build more will eventually need someone to assist someone, to learn, someone whose presence would allow the work to continue past what one pair of hands could manage alone. She was also thinking about the Dowell children. "I need someone to keep watch on the materials here through the night," she said. "There was interference once." She did not say what the interference had been or who she suspected. "I'd pay in kind, stone for storage space which I have to spare. And if Hector wants to learn the building method, I'll teach him what I know." Parrott looked at her for a long moment. "That's generously framed." "It's honestly framed," she said. "I need a night watch. He needs income. The framing is whatever gets both things done." Parrott went. By the following week, Hector Dowell appeared at the ledge in the late afternoon, moving carefully on the wet granite, with the particular physical intelligence of a man who has relearned his balance after losing something he'd relied on. He had dark eyes and a quiet face, and he looked at the structure the way Nels Parrott had first looked at it, with an assessment that held no judgment, only the gathering of information. He said, "Parrott says you'll teach." "What I know," she said. "Which isn't everything." "More than I know." "Then we start there." She showed him the through stones first, because that was the principle that held everything else together. He was a good student, not quick but exact, which was more valuable. He held each stone for longer than she did before placing it, rotating it in his one good hand, and the crook of his shortened arm reading its faces. When he made a mistake, he undid it without being asked and did it again. The Dowell children came after school on the days when Opal could spare them. They were ages 4, 6, 8, and 10, and they had the serious, watchful quality of children who have understood early that their household requires their cooperation. The two oldest helped carry smaller stones. The younger two organized the offcuts and sorted chips by size, a task Astrid invented for them and which turned out to be genuinely useful. She taught them as she worked, not lectures she never stopped to explain. She spoke as she built, narrating what her hands were doing in the matter-of-fact way her father had narrated his work to her, and they listened and watched and absorbed what they could. By the end of October, the Dowell family had enough seasoned driftwood stored inside the structure to carry them through December. Astrid had shown Hector the 3 core principles of dry stone laying, and he could execute 2 of them without guidance. The first cold front came on a Tuesday in early November, dropping the temperature from 40 degrees to 18 overnight and bringing with it a wind from the northwest that had nothing gentle in it. The fog was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it seemed almost aggressive, the horizon line visible all the way to the edge of the world. The harbor boats pulled hard at their moorings. The spruce trees on the ridge above the village moved in the wind in a way that looked almost desperate. Astrid was still working on the corbelled section of the secondary wall, a small extension she had decided to add on the south face, a windbreak that would protect the entrance when the temperature dropped fast enough to make her hands slow. She worked through it. She had been warm enough to have opinions about cold, and she was past that now. The wind dropped suddenly around 3 in the afternoon. This was not reassuring. In her experience, wind that stops in the afternoon of a November day in Maine has not finished with you. It has simply paused to gather. She looked at the roof. She looked at the section of the corbelling she had not yet closed, 3 capstones still to be placed on the secondary extension, the gap left open over perhaps 2 feet of wall where the final course needed to be set. She had planned to do it tomorrow. The stones were sorted and ready. The pitch was warm enough to work with. Tomorrow was too late. She understood this with a suddenness that had no drama to it. Just the flat recognition that the weather she was looking at and the unfinished work she was looking at could not both exist through a single night without one of them damaging the other. If the wind came back as hard as it had left and drove rain or sleet through the open section, the interior would be wet by morning. The Dowell family's wood supply would be wet. The interior stone surface would freeze in the night and expand and crack. Everything she had built in the last 3 weeks would survive. Dry stone does not come apart in one storm, but the work she had not finished would be undone, and the thing she had built to protect would not be protected. She sent the Dowell children home. She kept Hector. They worked until the light went completely, placing the final capstones by feel and by lantern light, the flame bending hard in the gusts that came ahead of the returning weather. She held each stone while Hector guided it from below, his one hand on the underside, his shortened arm pressing against the wall for stability. Their breathing made clouds in the cold air. The lantern swung on its hook. The last stone went in at full dark. Astrid pressed her hands flat against the completed roof and felt it. Solid. The closure was clean. She moved to the interior and held the lantern up and looked at the ceiling. No gaps. No daylight visible anywhere, the corbelled stones interlocking in the even curve that meant the load was distributing correctly. She came back outside. The wind was building again from the north, the temperature dropping as it came, and the first drops of something that was not quite rain and not quite sleet began to touch her face. She looked at the lantern in her hand. The flame was burning hard in the wind, pulling sideways, straining against the glass, but holding. She had been burning it for hours and the oil was low. She could hear the difference in the way it burned, a slight change in the quality of the light. She started back up the path toward the village. It happened 10 steps from the ledge. A gust hit from a direction she hadn't anticipated, a lateral shift, the kind that comes off water when the storm front is crossing at an angle, and it caught the lantern broadside, and the glass chimney, old and somewhat imperfect, cracked along a seam that had probably been there for years, and the flame went out. Not flickered, not guttered. Out. Complete darkness on the path, the rocks invisible underfoot, the wind now coming hard from 3 directions at once. She stood still and waited for her eyes to find what light there was in the sky, and in the few seconds that took, She was aware of the cold moving into the space where the warmth of the lantern had been, aware of the path under her feet shifting from something known to something she would have to navigate carefully, aware that the lantern in her hand was no longer the lantern she had carried every day since the harbor master had brought back Einar's coat. It was cold glass and dead wick. She made it back to the village without falling. She came inside and set the lantern on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a long time. In the darkness of the house, she did not light a candle. She did not build a fire. She stood with the dead lantern in the dark for a time that she did not measure, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel through all the weeks of planning and building and fighting something without a precise name. The feeling that comes when you have been holding something together through will alone, and the will briefly stops being enough. Tomorrow she would find a new glass chimney. Tomorrow she would refill the oil. Tomorrow she would light it again. But tonight the lantern was out for the first time since Einar had died, and outside the storm was building over the Atlantic. And inside the structure on the ledge, the Dowell family's firewood was dry and safe behind walls that would not move. And she sat down in the dark kitchen and listened to the wind find every gap in the old house walls, and she stayed very still because some nights the only thing left to do is let the dark be dark. The storm lasted 2 days. She knew this from inside the old house where she stayed and worked by candlelight and listened to the Atlantic dismantle the November air above the peninsula. The wind came in waves rather than steadily long silences, followed by assaults that shook the window frames and drove rain against the glass in sounds like thrown gravel. In the silences she could hear the harbor, or rather she could hear what the harbor was doing to the boats in it, the strained complaining of rope under load, the hollow knock of hulls against their moorings. She did not go to the ledge. Not because she was afraid of what she would find, but because there was nothing useful she could do there in weather like this. And she had learned enough from stone and from tide and from the particular patience of someone who has spent a winter in Maine to understand that some processes require you to wait rather than intervene. She made use of the time. She reread Einar's sketch by candlelight, this time not looking for what to build, but looking at how he had thought about it, the sequence of decisions embedded in the drawing, the order in which he had addressed problems. She had been inside his reasoning for weeks now, following it stone by stone, and she found that she could trace his thinking the way she could trace a familiar path in the dark, not by seeing it, but by knowing where it went. She also, for the first time, went through the rest of the tin box. She had counted the money on the day she found it. She had not looked carefully at the other things in the box. The pump parts, a folded letter she had assumed was practical correspondence, a small wooden object she had set aside without examining. On the second day of the storm, with the wind loud enough to make silence inside the house feel like something earned, she sat at the kitchen table and went through all of it. The folded letter was not correspondence. It was addressed to her in Einar's hand, and dated September 12th, 9 days before the storm, 9 days after the will. She read it twice before she understood it fully, and then she sat for a moment with it open in her hands. It was not a letter of explanation. Einar had not been the kind of man who explained himself at length. It was a letter of instruction, practical and precise, covering 4 things he wanted her to know. First, the location of a second property document, a survey of the ledge's exact boundaries filed with the county recorder in Rockland, which would supersede any local claim. Second, the name of a solicitor in Rockland who had a copy of the will and instructions to act on Astrid's behalf if needed. Third, a description of 2 additional driftwood deposits along the south shore that she would not have found without knowing where to look. Fourth, and last, a single sentence that was not instruction. You know how to read what is there. You have always known. I am only telling you to trust it. She set the letter down on the table beside the candle. Outside, the storm hit one of its periodic silences. In that silence she could hear the harbor, and in the harbor she could hear the boats, and underneath all of it, very faint, the deep and patient sound of the Atlantic going about its permanent business, indifferent to everything she had been through and everything she still had to do. She picked up the small wooden object from the bottom of the tin box. She had not looked at it carefully before. She looked at it now. It was a carving small enough to fit in her closed hand, worn smooth from handling. A small boat simply made with a flat hull and a single mast, the diameter of a matchstick. She turned it over and found on the bottom of the hull 2 initials scratched into the wood, EV. She sat with it for a long time, running her thumb along the hull the way he must have done, feeling the grain of the wood through her fingertip, the slight irregularity of the mast joint where the wood had been worked with a knife rather than a tool. When the storm broke on the morning of the third day, she put on her coat and picked up the dead lantern and walked to the ledge. The structure was unchanged. This should not have surprised her. She had built it to withstand exactly this, but it did, in the way that proof always surprises you a little, even when you were confident of the outcome. The walls stood as she had left them. The corbelled roof had shed the rain cleanly to either side, leaving the interior dry. The floor of the interior was cold but not wet. The Dowell family's firewood stacked against the back wall was exactly as it had been. She ran her hand along the outer wall face. The stones were cold and wet from the rain, but solid, no movement when she pressed. The through stones were holding the two faces together exactly as Cecily had shown her they would. She went inside and stood in the dim interior and looked up at the corbelled ceiling and felt the stillness of a space that has been tested and held. Then she looked at the gap where the storm lantern should hang. She had carried it down from the house, the dead lantern, the cracked chimney. She could hang it there as it was a dark lantern, a placeholder. Or she could go to the general store and buy a new chimney glass and continue as if the lantern had always been what it was before, a working light, a practical object, nothing more than what it appeared. She was still thinking about this when she heard footsteps on the path. Not Cecily's careful steps, not Parrot's deliberate ones. These were heavier, and she recognized them before she turned around, the way you recognize a sound that has been part of your life for a long time and has not occurred for long enough that hearing it again is startling. Aldous Voss stood at the top of the ledge path at the place where the stone met the shore, and he looked at the structure for a long time before he looked at her. He was alone. He had not brought anyone, which told her something. He was not here in any official capacity, or with any further legal argument arranged. He was here as a man, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has spent 2 days in a storm thinking about something and has come to a conclusion he did not want to reach. He did not come all the way down to the ledge. He stood at the top of the path and looked at her and looked at the structure and then reached into his coat. He brought out a small wooden box, the kind that hardware comes in, or small valuables pine with a fitted lid. He held it for a moment without speaking. Then he set it down on the flat rock at the top of the path carefully, as if it were heavier than it looked. His voice, when it came, was flat and precise. He would have wanted you to have these. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the box. Then he turned and went back up the path toward the village, his steps on the wet stone exactly as she had remembered them. Heavy, deliberate, the steps of a man who understands power, walking away from the last thing he had used it for. She climbed the path and picked up the box. Inside, on a small folded cloth, were the things Aldous had taken from the house after Einar died. Things she had noticed were missing, and had not allowed herself to think about too directly, because thinking about them directly required thinking about the man who had taken them. A bone comb, the teeth worn on one side from years of use. A small book cloth covered the pages, warped from having been wet once and dried. A photograph mounted on cardstock, slightly faded, Einar and Astrid at their wedding, standing in front of the Lutheran church with the expressions of people who had not yet learned to be comfortable in front of a camera. She stood on the path with the box in her hands and looked at the photograph for a long time. She had not seen his face in weeks, not in any fixed form, only in the ways that she carried it in memory, in the sketch he had drawn, in the objects he had left for her. Now she looked at it directly, and something that had been held tightly in her chest since the harbor master had brought her. His coat released slowly, like a knot coming undone, not all at once, but strand by strand. She did not decide to cry. She simply found that she was quietly in the way that people cry when they have been holding something together for a long time, and something finally tells them it is safe to stop. She stood on the path above the ledge for a long time. The harbor was very calm after the storm. The boats had settled back to their ordinary positions. The sky was the particular shade of clear that only comes after weather has worked through a place and left it clean. She wiped her face. She put the photograph and the book and the comb back in the box. She went down to the ledge. She took the cracked chimney off the dead lantern and looked at it in the morning light. The crack ran along one seam clean and complete. It had not shattered, which meant the glass had been old and tired rather than thin. She looked at the crack for a moment, and then she did something she had not planned. She went to the general store and bought a new chimney glass. She came back to the ledge and fitted it, and filled the oil and struck a match. The lantern lit on the first try. The flame came up clean and steady amber in the November light, smaller than the daylight around it, but present. She carried it inside the structure and hung it on the iron hook on the back wall, where its light reached the interior and cast through the entrance onto the path outside. She stood in the entrance and looked at the flame. The light fell on the corbelled ceiling, and on the sorted stones along the back wall, and on the stacked driftwood. It fell on the floor of the interior, the cold granite that held whatever warmth there was, and gave it back slowly. It reached through the entrance and touched the path just barely, the outermost edge of the amber circle meeting the gray of the stone and stopping. Outside, the harbor was visible from the entrance, the boats at their moorings, the dock, the pale light on the water. She had not planned the entrance to face this direction. Einar had planned it. Einar had known that a woman working alone in the early morning and the late evening would need to be able to see the harbor from her work, to know whether a boat was in or out, to maintain that particular thread of connection between the land and the water that anyone who lives on this coast understands as a kind of lifeline. He had also known something else. She understood it now for the first time, standing in the entrance with the lantern burning behind her. The entrance faced the harbor approach. The light from the lantern carried through the entrance opening, projected outward in a narrow band toward the water. It was not a strong light, nothing like the lamp on the dock that guided boats in from the open sea. But it was a light at a fixed point, a reference, a mark on the shore that a boat's captain could use to orient himself in relation to the entrance channel. Einar had designed the entrance this way deliberately. He had calculated the angle. He had known that the lantern Astrid would use, his lantern, the one he was already planning to leave in the pocket of his coat, would project through the opening at exactly the angle needed to serve as a secondary mark, not replacing the harbor lamp, but adding to it, triangulating with it in a way that gave a captain coming in on a dark night one more fixed point of reference. He had built it into the design. He had not told her, because to tell her would have been to tell her why he was making a plan for a day he might not return from, and he had not wanted to frighten her. Instead, he had put the answer inside the question and trusted her to find it. She stood in the entrance and felt this understanding move through her, not like a shock, but like the tide she had been thinking about all autumn, the thing that doesn't argue, the thing that simply comes back. She felt it arrive and settle and become part of the ground she was standing on. After a while, she went and found Hector Dowell. He came that afternoon and she showed him what she had understood about the entrance angle and the lantern's projection. He stood in the entrance for a long time, looking toward the harbor, calculating the way she had seen him calculate the placement of every stone she had taught him. His voice was careful. He thought about everything. He thought about what he knew to think about, she said, which was a great deal. Hector looked at the interior, at the walls, the ceiling, the stacked wood that belonged to his family. He had not said anything about the arrangement she had made, the fiction of the night watch, and the payment in kind, except once early on when he had said only, "I know what you did. I won't forget it." She had not responded to this because it required no response. Now he said, "I want to learn the entrance construction, the corbelling on the threshold." "Why the threshold specifically?" "Because that's the part that faces out," he said. "If I'm going to build my own, that's the part I need to get right." She taught him the threshold that afternoon and the following morning. By the end of the second morning, he could execute it without her guidance, his single hand and his shortened arm working together in the coordinated way they had developed over weeks, stone by stone, the body finding what it needs when given enough time and enough reason. In December, she helped him mark the footprint of a small storage structure on the south wall of his family's property, sheltered from the north wind by the house, positioned for the same solar gain that made the ledge structure warm by mid-morning. The foundation stones went in during the first week of December, laid before the hard freeze made the ground unworkable. Hector did the laying himself with his two oldest children, sorting and passing stones. She came by every few days and checked the walls. She said nothing unless something was wrong, and increasingly nothing was wrong. The winter of 1879 was the kind of winter that Maine remembers: sustained cold from December through February, the harbor freezing out to the first mooring line by January, the roads closing for 3 days in the last week of the year after a storm that dropped 16 inches of snow and then glazed it with ice. It was the kind of winter that found every gap in every wall and every crack in every plan. The structure on the southern ledge held without incident. The Dowell children came and went through the winter, taking what they needed from the wood supply inside, as did two other families who had asked quietly after the committee hearing whether they might store some things on the ledge through the cold months. Astrid said yes to both, and she did not track the arrangement carefully because the arrangement was not the kind that required careful tracking. It was the kind that ran on trust, which is always cheaper than paper. She spent the winter months doing what the winter made possible: careful work, close work, the work of studying what she had built and understanding it fully. She made drawings of her own in a small notebook she bought from the general store, recording the measurements and the techniques and the specific decisions she had made and why. Not because she thought anyone would ever read them, but because the act of writing a thing down changed how you understood it, and she had more to understand than she had yet managed. Cecily Briggs came to the ledge on a Sunday morning in January when the harbor was frozen and the light on the snow had that flat blue quality that belongs to deep winter. She stood in the entrance for a while and looked at the interior and then at the lantern on its hook, which Astrid had kept burning through the season as a working light. Her voice was quiet. "Nels says the night crews have been using it to orient their approach." "I know," Astrid said. "He says it's more reliable than the dock lamp because it doesn't get knocked in weather." "The dock lamp is on a post that moves," Astrid said. "Mine is on a stone that doesn't." Cecily looked at the lantern for a moment. The amber light was smaller than the winter daylight around it, but inside the stone structure it was warm and definite, the flame holding absolutely steady in the windless interior. "Your husband understood this coast," Cecily said. "He understood it very well," Astrid agreed. They stood together in the entrance for a while, looking out at the frozen harbor and the pale January sky, the boats locked into the ice at their moorings, like words held in mid-sentence waiting for the season to release them. Spring came the way it always comes to Maine, not suddenly but incrementally, the light changing before the temperature, the days lengthening in small increments that you could only measure by accumulation. By March, the harbor was open again. By April, the fishing boats were going out daily, and the ledge path was soft enough with new growth that it needed clearing, and the structure on the southern shore had become a feature of the landscape that people had stopped noticing, in the specific way that you stop noticing something that belongs where it is. Opal Dowell gave birth in February to a girl they named Astrid. She heard this from Nell's parrot, who told her with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man reporting a weather change, and she stood for a moment after he had gone, holding the information, turning it over as she had turned stones over, reading its surfaces. She went to visit when the child was 3 weeks old. Opal was up and moving, which was what you did, and the child was in her arms, eyes closed, the particular concentrated stillness of a new person who is still mostly learning how to be. Hector stood near the window, with the posture of a man who is trying to be quiet enough to match the occasion. Astrid looked at the child for a while. Then she looked at Opal. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the name had not already said. Opal looked back at her, and in that look was everything the name meant: gratitude. Yes, but also recognition. One woman to another of the particular difficulty and the particular power of building something with what you have, when what you have is never quite enough and always in the end sufficient. She walked back to the ledge in the April morning, the path soft under her boots, the harbor on her left moving with the easy swell of a season that was remembering how to be warm. She went inside the structure and stood in the interior for a moment, running her hand along the back wall. The stones were cool under her palm, the surfaces rough in a way that had become completely familiar. She had begun teaching more formally in the winter. Not a school, nothing organized. Simply if someone came to the ledge and asked how the walls were built, she showed them. 3 of the fishermen's wives had come, one of the younger harbor workers, a man from the next village who had heard about the committee hearing and come to look at the structure and ended up staying for 2 hours while she walked him through the corbelling technique. She had been asked twice whether she would come to teach at other locations. She had said yes both times. In her notebook, the measurements and techniques were becoming something more organized, not a manual exactly, but a record, the kind of record that could survive its maker. She was aware of this dimly without making too much of it. She wrote what she knew. She drew what she had built. She noted what had worked and what had needed correction and what she would do differently with a second structure and what she had learned from Cecily that she had not been able to find anywhere else. The lantern hung on its hook on the back wall. She took it down now and filled it from the oil tin she kept in the corner and replaced the chimney glass. The third glass she had used the first two, having cracked in the winter cold, and carried it to the entrance. She hung it there on the hook at the entrance frame that she had positioned in the first week before she understood why Einar had placed the opening as he had. The morning light was coming in from the southeast, low and clear, the April sun still close to the horizon at this hour. It came through the entrance at the angle it had always come, the angle Einar had calculated, and it fell on the interior stones and on the back wall and on the lantern's glass, and where it touched the glass it threw a small still point of refracted light onto the stone floor. She had been looking at this every morning for 6 months. She had not been looking at it the right way. The point of light on the floor was not random. It fell in the same place every morning at the same time at the same angle because the sun moves predictably, and the entrance was fixed, and the distance between them was constant. In winter it fell further south. In summer it would fall further north. But at this time of year, at this hour, it fell exactly in the center of the entrance threshold, the stone she and Hector had laid together, the one she had taught him last, because she had told him it was the most important. Einar had known this too, she was certain of it. A man who had watched the light on the water for 30 years, who had navigated by the sun and the stars and the angle of shadow on the sail, he had known exactly where the morning light would fall inside a structure he had designed. He had put the threshold stone there. He had made it the center. She stood in the entrance with the lantern in her hand, the morning light coming through from outside and the lantern's amber light waiting to begin, and she understood the last thing he had left her. The lantern was for the dark. The design was for the light. He had built her a place that was useful in both, that held the light when it came and offered its own when it didn't. That was never entirely without illumination, that was always oriented toward the harbor and the open sea and the direction from which anything good had ever come. She hung the lantern in the entrance in the morning light, and it swung once on its hook and then was still. Outside, the harbor was alive with the sounds of April boats moving out on the early tide, the knock of wood against the dock, the calls of the men making ready, and underneath it all, the long, steady breathing of the Atlantic, doing what it had always done, neither kind nor unkind, vast and patient and present. She put her hand on the entrance stone and felt it cold and exact and permanent. The stone her husband had thought about before she knew there was a stone to think about. The stone that held the morning light and held her hand now, and would hold both long after she was gone. The tide was going out. It would come back. It always came back. If there is someone in your life who left something behind, not an object, not money, not even words, but a direction, a design, something you only understood long after they were gone, then you know what this story is really about. Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. And if stories told this way matter to you, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another one waiting to be told.